Hi, this is Ron Cipcic. In this particular lesson, we're going to take a look at monetary aggregates, particularly how do you measure them. And when we're talking about monetary aggregates, we're talking about monetary totals for the entire economic system. One of the basic principles we need to understand right up front about money is that there is a difference between the actual money supply, what is measured, and what the money supply could potentially be. And earlier in our monetary studies, we looked at the deposit expansion multiplier process, and we learned that because banks hold excess reserves and because people hold currency, the actual expansion is not as great as what it could potentially be, its maximum. So carrying that idea forward, if money is deposits, and that's what money primarily is. When we talk about money, we're primarily talking about deposits. If money is deposits, and if deposits are not as expanded as what they could be, then the actual level of deposits or the actual level of the money supply is less than what it could potentially be. Again, to understand this, we really need to get this idea in our heads that when we talk about money in a modern monetary system, we're talking about the level of deposits in the banking system. Most money, particularly if we define money as M2, most money is in the form of deposits, not in the form of paper carried around or coins carried around in people's pockets, purses, or whatever. All right, so the actual money supply, what the government actually measures, is always less than what it can potentially be. Why? Because banks hold excess reserves and people hold currency. And this, of course, is currency in circulation. By the way, when we say currency in circulation, we're talking, let me just put a little IC after that to remind us of that. We talk about currency in circulation, we're talking about currency that is being held by parties outside the banking system. If currency is held by a bank, for instance, if currency is in the vault of the bank, then that currency is actually not in circulation and is not part of the money supply. Currency is only part of the money supply if it's actually held by someone outside the banking system. Okay, all right, well, let's go ahead and continue with our lesson. There's so much to do and so little time to get it done, so let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so we are given this monetary data here. Deposits are the primary foundation for the money supply, so there's deposits. And again, deposits are an asset. It's a stock. So notice that I put the word stock up here. When you talk about monetary data, you're talking about data at a point in time. A day later, a week later, a month later, a year later, the data is different. The data moves over time. So when you look at it at a point in time, you hold it constant. But deposits are an asset. It's something held at a point in time. Likewise, currency is an asset held at a point in time. And reserves, remember what reserves are. This is an asset held by a bank against its deposits. And there are two types of reserves. There are required reserves. These are reserves that banks are obligated to carry against its deposits. Notice in this case that banks are holding what? Banks are holding $800 against $8,000. And if we just do a quick calculation here, if you take the required reserves of 800, divide it by the level of deposits, you can get what we call the percentage reserve requirement. So it's evident here that banks are holding $800, are legally obligated to hold $800 against what? $8,000 in deposits. So it must be that the reserve ratio in this case is 10%. Now, reserve ratios vary with the level of deposits, how much are held. They also vary with the type of account. All right, but we're not going to go into that right now. We'll assume that all deposits are of similar kind and quality, and we're going to assume a 10% reserve requirement on all deposits. Of course, banks can hold more reserves than they're required to carry, and in this case, we assume that banks are holding $300 above what is required. If you put these two together, you see that the total reserves are 1,100, and we'll be using that number later. All right, so What we want to do with this data is we want to actually calculate the size of the circles, the actual money supply, the inside circle, and the outside circle called the potential money supply. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive right in and do that. I'm going to scroll down and begin doing our calculations for us. The first calculation we're going to do is we're going to calculate, in fact, let me change the color here, and let's get rid of that red. It's a little too much in your face, eh? Alright, so let's first of all calculate the actual money supply. Now this is a very straightforward calculation. It's almost definitional based on the data given. If we take deposits, bank deposits, add them together to currency, again, in circulation, we're going to get the actual money supply. So if we take 8,000, add it to the $400 in currency that is being held in circulation. Again, in circulation means held outside the banking system. Add those together, we get a total money supply, actual money supply of $8,400. So our inside circle is $8,400. Okay, we'll go back up in a little bit, and we'll tack that on to the inside circle. Okay, let's keep going. Keep moving here. The second calculation we'd like to do is to calculate the potential money supply. Okay, and a fairly straightforward calculation, except we're going to have to do two steps. The first thing we need is something called the monetary base. Now you're going to learn as you study money and banking even more, when you go more deeply into the subject, that this thing called the monetary base is a very, very important idea. The reason is the Fed, the Federal Reserve System, the U.S. central bank, does not directly control the money supply. In the United States, we have a private banking system. Money basically is held by a privately owned banking system. So the Federal Reserve System doesn't directly control the quantity of deposits and that sort of thing. It doesn't even control the quantity of reserves, or excuse me, the quantity of currency in circulation. What the Fed can do is it can manipulate the size of the monetary base, and by manipulating the size of the monetary base, it can manipulate the size of the potential money supply, which will ultimately affect the size of the actual money supply. Now, all of that is beyond the scope of this lesson. It'll be talked about later on in our discussions about monetary policy. But the key idea is the monetary base is the variable, the money aggregate that the Fed really targets and controls. Okay? It can alter the size of that number, and because it alters the size of that number, it can alter other conditions in the banking system. So how do you calculate it? Well, it's a fairly straightforward calculation. If you take the reserves that banks are holding, now reserves can be excess and required, and the assets that can be held as reserves can be vault cash. Any cash that's in the vault is a reserve. By the way, reserves are not part of the money supply. Reserves are part of the monetary base, but they're not part of M1 and M2. That's interesting. So the idea here is that any cash that's held by a bank is not in circulation. If you take the currency that's being held by a bank and any deposits that that bank has with the Federal Reserve System, that is the level of its reserves. Okay? Alright, if you take reserves, add it to currency in circulation. Again, this is currency that's not being held by banks. If you add that together, we run out of room, so let me scroll down a little bit. If you add that together, what you get is the monetary base. Now we'll abbreviate monetary base with MB. Okay? So reserves plus currency equal monetary base. So what do we have here? We've got 800 required reserves plus 300 excess reserves. Add those together. 1,100 plus $400 in currency, currency in circulation, add those together, you get $1,500. So the monetary base is $1,500. Now, let's go ahead and scroll down. If you take, this is part B, if you take the monetary base and you divide it by the percentage reserve requirement, you get the potential money supply. All right, so you have to get the monetary base first. You have to know what the reserve ratio is. We did that a little bit earlier. So if you take the 1,500, divide it by the 0.10. Remember we said the percentage reserve ratio is 10%. 10% is 0.10. Okay, so 1,500 divided by 0.10 is 15,000. So the potential money supply is 15,000. That's the size of the outside circle. All right, so let's go ahead and let's scroll back up. I'm getting kind of messy here. I'm going to erase that. So erase that. I like to use my eraser function. So anytime I can make a mark on the page and erase it, I like it. I mean, I don't like it. I mean, I like it. I mean, I don't like it. I mean, I like it. You got to get joy out of the little things in life, you know. It's fun kind of fussing around. The economics is great. Playing with the pen tool, wow, it's over the top. All right, so the actual money supply, let's get rid of that scrolling feature. The actual money supply is, whoa, come on now. The actual money supply, what? Oh, I gotta get off the erase feature. Is 8,400. Actual money supply is 8,400. The potential money supply is what? 15,000. So we can see here, boy, that doesn't look very good, does it? Gives me another chance to use my erasing function. There we go. Back to pen, back to midnight blue, 15,000. Okay, so we can see that the actual money supply is only about half, a little over half, actually it's about 56% of the potential money supply. And we can see that that must be caused because banks are holding excess reserves and because people are holding currency. Well, if we scroll down and look at our data, that's exactly what we see. That's exactly what we see. We see that people are holding $400 in currency and banks are holding what? $300 in excess reserves, and that is causing that actual money supply to be smaller than what it can potentially be. Now, the question that will jump into your head, if it hasn't already, is, well, 400 and 300 is 700. There's a much bigger difference between 8,400 and 15,000 than 700. How does this jive? Well, remember, these excess reserves, if they were loaned out by a bank, they would expand by a factor, and the factor would actually be 10. If these $300 were full, if this $300 in excess reserves were loaned out and fully expanded, it would expand out to 3,000. And I'm going to prove that to you a little bit later. If this currency were deposited, in other words, people stopped holding paper money and put all of their paper money into the banking system, so now they're carrying deposits instead of paper money, this 400 would expand to 4,000. Now, I'm not going to take the time to reconcile, to explain mathematically the difference between 8,400 and 15,000. It's a fairly easy series of calculations, but it's really beyond the scope of this, so I'm not going to do that. But, uh-oh, I just made a mark up there, I'm sorry. Gotta get rid of that. But let's just know that it's because of these two factors, currency in circulation and excess reserves in the banking system, that inside circle is inside the outside circle. Look, if there were no currency in circulation and there were no excess reserves, we'd only have one calculation, and that would be the potential money supply. All right? Okay, so let's continue on. There's a couple other little things I'd like to do to kind of wrap this lesson up. We've done the heavy lifting. Let's just do a couple other things. I want to show you the multipliers. the multiplier effects. And I'm actually going to show you a little bit about how they're used, as long as you've got me here. Okay, so let's go to calculation 3. I guess I better get a pen. Go to calculation 3, wrong color. So now I have to erase. See, one of the troubles with this is you gotta keep track of colors, what mode you're in, and when you're just sitting here on a day drinking coffee, trying to think. There, I took another big sip of coffee. That should help. All right. So if we take, if we want to calculate the potential, boy, it's getting worse. Potential. I want to impress you. It's really hard to respect a teacher who can't spell. I have serious troubles with that. Potential or maximum money multiplier. All right, here we go. So if we take 1 over the percentage reserve requirement, or 1 over 0.10, this will give us the maximum money multiplier, which is 10. So every dollar in the monetary base can expand as much as $10. Okay, and we'll be showing you that a little bit, showing you how that's applied a little bit later. Okay, and then step 4, what is the actual money multiplier? We know that it's not as great. We know that because banks are holding excess reserves and people are holding currency, that the actual multiplication is not as great. Well, what is it? It's got to be less than 10, but what is it? Let's take a look. Okay, there we go. If you take the actual money supply and divide it by the monetary base, you get the actual money multiplier. This is the actual money multiplier. So what do we got? We got 8,400 divided by what? A monetary base of 1,500. And that gives us an actual money multiplier of 5.6. So theoretically, no excess reserves, no currency in circulation, every dollar in the monetary base could expand by a factor of 10. However, given the amount of excess reserves that banks are now holding and the level of currency that are people holding, the actual expansion is only 5.6. There's an interesting little fact here. I'll just point it out. And you maybe already have made the connection, but if you haven't, it's okay. If you take 5.6 and compare it to 10, that's the same ratio as 8,400 compared to 15,000. So you remember I said earlier that the actual money supply is only 56% of its potential. This is 0.56, which is 56%, and so the actual money supply is only at 56% of its potential, but the reason is people are holding excess reserves and people are holding currency. Now this is not a problem. This really is not a problem. It's just kind of, it is what it is. But you'll see later on that this has to be accounted for in what we call monetary policy. Let me show you one final thing. The caffeine is kicking in, so I'm feeling motivated. If you take the change in the monetary base and you multiply it by the maximum money multiplier, you get the change in the potential money supply. So if $1 is added here, $1 times 10 equals $10 added here. Oh yeah, oh yeah. And so every dollar added to the monetary base, based on the percentage reserve requirement we had earlier. Remember, This is determined by 1 over the percentage reserve requirement. So based on the reserve ratio of 10%, every dollar added to the monetary base can potentially expand the potential money supply by $10. But if you take the change in the monetary base times the actual money multiplier, you get the change in the actual money supply. And of course, that's not as big. If you add $1 to the monetary base, by the way, we'll learn later that it's the Fed who can change the size of the monetary base. If the Fed adds $1 to the monetary base and the actual money multiplier is only 5.6, then that increases the actual money supply not by 10, but by $5.60. So monetary policymakers are concerned more with the actual money supply than they are with the potential. They want to know how will their actions affect the actual. Well, you got to work back then to what is the actual money multiplier, and that's going to tell us how a policy, maybe the policy is to add to the monetary base, is going to affect. This is the outcome. This is the policy result. Okay, and much more on this is coming, but today what we basically want to nail down is the idea of what is the actual money supply versus the potential. How do you measure each of those? In other words, how do you calculate them, and how are they related to each other? All right, that concludes our lesson.